we as medievalists might have been taking for granted. So for Ahmed, I was thinking about two things in relation to your talk. One is, and this is not at all a criticism of your framework, I'm just trying to think with you. I wonder if talking about rupture and disruption is the most productive way to think about this, because doesn't it, in a way, overestimate the time horizon on which people think, which is to say that people are not generally aware of rupture. What they are aware of is their own kind of sense of entitlement to the past, some kind of a sense of deserving something better than what they have. And so they're reaching into the past for that. So I wonder if you can just maybe play with that conceptually a little bit. And then related to that, I mean, it's very interesting what you say about sort of the focus on texts and the recovery of texts. I was talking to my undergraduate class a couple of weeks ago about, like, you know, we have all these amazing artisans from medieval Egypt and we don't know their names except in very, very rare cases. And why is it that we can, like, you know, recognize like a giotto? And then I realized, well, who are the people that we've heard of? They're poets. They're people who work with language. And that the ideology of language, the ideology of Arabic within Arabophone culture is so central that that I wonder whether, and this is really, you know, just a comment for the group, we need to maybe think about the antiquarian project a little bit differently from how we might think about the European one, which is to say that there is going to be a focus on language and on texts, maybe even more than you would find in Europe. So that's just something for you to play with. And then for Elkem, it's really, I mean, it was such a great talk in so many ways. But I just want to kind of also play with your ideas. It seems like one of the things that you're going for is a notion of kitsch. So in other words, like self-orientalization, a sort of, you know, mirror of, quote, Oriental culture from the eyes of Europe. And I was thinking about a conversation that I had with Stefan yesterday. I asked him about the ISIS symbol and what it's actually based on, and because I thought, well, maybe there's some like early Islamic coin or something, and he informed me that no, it's actually based on a forgery. So, which is kind of the ultimate example of kitsch, right? And so I wonder if you just could explore kitsch on a conceptual level, and then, and this is a very unfair question, which you can ignore, if you can also maybe talk about your own interest in sort of exposing kitsch in the late Ottoman period. Is there, am I detecting correctly some kind of a maybe polemic against the current swing of the pendulum towards an Ottomanizing discourse in Turkey?
Okay, so as for the notion of rupture, this is very much a self. I mean, I think there's an objective nature to this. That there's a kind of institutional rupture in the Ottoman period in the Arab lands. Ali Mubarak writes the Khitat, and he compares Makrizi's Khitat to his own Khitat, to his own time, right? And he says, oh, look, in Makrizi's time, all these buildings for madrasas, now they're just mosques. I mean, all those are half have lapsed. You know, we had, you know, he says, Makrizi describes 70 working madrasas. Now the only teaching institution we have is Al-Azhar. Everything else has collapsed. And what happened to the books, for example? So that's one thing. So there's an objective dimension to it, but there's also a dimension of perception, which comes out, for example, in this debate, which is that, guys, you know, this shrine was unknown until recently, and like your historical memory has become so narrow that you can't even perceive this. You can't even perceive that for 1,000 years nobody thought that the granddaughter of Paul was buried here, and now everybody thinks, you know, I mean, there's a certain, there's a lack of historical memory in the form of texts, which has led to the fact that you can attribute anything to any building now. Mm-hmm. So there is, this sense of crisis is part of the narrative, and it's very strong in our field. So people who work on the 17th, 18th century, like somebody like Khalid Rouahi, they're very hostile to these Nahda figures because, in a sense, they are right. I mean, the Nahda figure says the 18th century was a time when terrible things happened,
the desert,
nothing happened, or not enough happened, and they're working on trying to study and show value in works written in the 18th century. So there is clearly this is very much of a sense that they have about that they are living in a rupture, that they are reviving something. It's partly about the language. It's surprising how strong this narrative is that they're reviving Arabic language as well against post-classical, whatever, Middle Arabic, however we call this. So it's this neo-classical Arabic poetry, etc., is very strong. And the second point was, you could remind me.
What was the second point? I don't know. We got the reverse now. Oh yeah, no, kitsch was.
Kitsch was for me.
Yeah. No, you got it both. You covered it. It was
There was a
both.
bit of kitsch, with Ahmed Zaki dressing up as a Yemeni. But anyway.
It was both rupture and also the sense of the centrality of language. So I think you covered it.
Okay, about kitsch. I mean, the 19th century is kitsch everywhere. I mean, look at so it's obvious that through acculturation, I think that's what really troubles me in Ottoman history in the 19th century. There's a lot of acculturation, self-orientalization, the projection of Orientalist tropes onto people you consider to be more Oriental than you. All this Ottoman Orientalism stuff is very superficial and therefore prone to kitsch because it uses ready-made forms that end up trumping content. And that's, I think, one of the definitions of kitsch in a sense. So in that sense, I think it's natural. Now, all of it is not horrible. I find, especially in Osman Hamdi, something very playful, which I like when he dresses up as a Kurdish warrior in Vienna, when he's exhibiting these costumes and whatever. I think there's something extremely playful in him, which is not really kitsch. Kitsch is when you take yourself seriously, which he did not, which I think is a major distinction. But the problem is that my real problem is not with the Ottomans in the 19th century, but rather with the way in which we look at them today, or even earlier. There is a tendency to have this wishful thinking about, making them look better than they really did, whereas I think that if the Ottomans had one merit, it was probably not that of creativity, but that of an incredible adaptability and a capacity to phagocyter, as you would say in French, to eat up and swallow and then create something very interesting from it. But much of it in the 19th century is very kitsch. I mean, you talked about symbols. You talked about the symbol of Daesh. Look at the Ottoman coat of arms. If you lived in Turkey, you would see it on every cab and whatever. And it's a creation. It's basically a Christmas tree that was created in the 1880s by Abdul Hamid in order to emulate the European model of having some kind of a dynastic and this is so typical of the 19th century. I mean, they have to come up with a middle age. Kurun Vusta, they will come with this neologism because, European history tells you that you should have a middle age before and whatever. And they love it because the middle age then has 1453 as the turning point. So they're part of but it's always extremely pragmatic and extremely versatile and fluid, which is both interesting and sometimes terrifying. But what really disturbs me is that the work we do with these texts and with the variety of texts and the genealogy of texts is so superficial. I mean, one example that goes in the direction of what I was saying is that there is a Shahnizadeh who was praised by everyone in 1820. Well, he didn't publish it. He published it later. But he was the chronicler of the empire, and so he wrote a mukaddimah, and he called it a mukaddimah, to his history, which everybody thought was extremely interesting because it brought in historical evidence, archaeological evidence as an element in the building of a narrative. He talked about the Paros marbles. He talked about, and I'm a cynic, and I'm extreme. So I didn't buy that. Maybe an Orientalist in that sense. You know, in the 19th century, in 1820, an Ottoman talking about the Paros marbles and Arundel, it doesn't convince me. So I Googled the text in all sorts of reverse ways and whatever, translated it into French, and boom, I found it. It was a very, very bad plagiarism of Voltaire's Histoire in the Encyclopédie. Now, which is interesting. It's extremely interesting, and you can do stuff with that as long as you know that is the case. You have to contextualize. This is almost universal with every text, and this goes back into the. I'm presently working on an Ottomanized version of the Alexander Romance, for example, which I can trace as being extremely different from the original text, with inspiration that comes. And this is not even my business because it's a medieval text. But why? Well, basically because everybody who works on a manuscript works on it as if it was in some kind of a bubble, with no links outside, inside, or in time, and therefore you have a very philological but dry thing. So all of this gives the possibility to historians, and especially cultural historians, to interpret everything in whatever the way they want, because, you know, the sky's the limit, because there's no way in which you can test all this evidence, because it's not evidence, because it's only bubbles, and they burst every time when you really look into the details of this. So this is my real. So Erdogan's kitsch and Ottomanist whatever, that's a fad. That's really not. It's extremely superficial, which obviously I hate and I will. But that's not my mission in life. My mission in life is rather to have a systematic, critical reading of text with no concerns about what this might mean about the political, cultural, whatever context. And I have a tendency to go for the half-empty glass. I have a tendency to be a little more cynical and whatever, but hey, everybody has it. But that's really what I'm concerned with.
I have, I guess, three hands. The order that I saw them was Stefan, Islam, and Elias. Elias, did you want us to come in right
I just want to respond to this, and it's just a very brief comment. I love this perspective because, and I think that it's not just a 19th century thing. I mean, so much of what you said speaks to the context that my panel addressed. And I think that that cynical perspective, and these terms that you use, kitsch, mishmash, bric-a-brac, the use of ready-made forms, so the lack of content superficiality, my intuition is that this is actually what's going on with a lot of these uses of the past, engagements with the past. And if we read too much into them as meaning something, sometimes, I mean, I think it's to do a disservice to the practice. And sometimes it's more about symbolizing something or what's the word, like kind of like flashing, marking. Signaling, that's it. Signaling a kind of affiliation. And it's less often in my context, and I think, and clearly in this context, that there is some kind of deep systematic engagement with these old forms. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Stefan?
So you portrayed a little bit this as this scholarly antiquarianism as a kind of scam. So museums without catalogues and imitation and plagiarism. So when I have only a limited knowledge about at that time. So when I look at the Museum Humayun, it published 5 catalogues, coin catalogues, which are standard of that time. So they are not scams, they are useful, still useful. And if I look at the collector scenes there, so there Mortman, so that is a kind, I don't see it bipolar and plagiarism of the West, I see it more as a kind of a continuum among the elite there. So there's the Mortmans and Supi Pasha, who collected and even wrote a layman's catalogue. So that we have an Ottoman elite somehow speaking with more, I would say these catalogues are, and sometimes less success to a global audience, and not a bipolar Ottoman Empire try to emulate. So it's from a European perspective a kind of provincial elite, but taking part in the larger discourse?
Okay, it's a very small elite. Obviously, yes, I agree. There's Supi Pasha, there's Munif Pasha. There are some people who are engaged in some kind of a project, but this project has no local audience. The catalogs, they're nice. Who reads them? Who? Osman Hamdi is one guy whose only obsession is basically to prove that he is one of the peers of the archaeologists of the time, and rightly so, because one of the problems is that everybody, treats him like a singe savant. There is that. When you look at, there's probably only Karl Humann who has a real friendship with him. If you look at the others, it's really very, very damning the way in which others speak about him. Because at the end of the day, he's an Ottoman who's playing archaeologist, and if he has one redeeming thing, it's that his father was a survivor of the Chios massacre, which makes him Greek, so it's a little bit, and he's got some kind of an education in, so he is in smack in the middle of Orientalism, and he is turning that around through his painting and through museology in order to prove himself. And I think that that's what I find playful in him, the way in which he sells these paintings, which are so Orientalist, based on really Orientalist crap, to the Western public, just because there is an Ottoman signature. I think it's a masterful play of, diverting, subverting Orientalism, not to attack it, but to use it to his own benefit. Now, for the museum, I agree. By the 1890s, they're doing things the proper way. The numismatic catalogs, Mottmann's Himyarite catalog, these are serious objects of study, again, in a bubble, in the sense that they're produced because the Ottoman Empire, the elite, is conscious that this is a checklist of civilization which you have to fill in order to be accepted. It does not mean, and I think that's one of the major problems, it does not mean that it really transpires into even some kind of a middling class in the Ottoman Empire. And when you look at the archaeologists, I mean, there's Osman Hamdi and Halil Ethem as Muslims.
Yeah, Makridi Bey.
As Muslims, and then you have Baltazzi, Makridi, Mistakidis, you have, and this is something that I find fascinating, you have 10s, 20s, 30s of school teachers, Greek school teachers, little municipal employees in Anatolia who do epigraphy, who are doing an antiquarian quest for their past, because I mean it's of course embedded in a nationalist vision of Greekness. You don't have the equivalent among the Turcophone Muslims of the guy who goes to, at best you have a couple of guys who do genealogy and biography based on tombstones, because it's the only information they have, but for the rest you don't have an equivalent, and that's really a problem. And I think that's where you have again a difference between the Arab tradition and the Turkish tradition. If you look at the production of Arab intellectuals, middling classes in Aleppo, in Damascus, it's comparatively incredible, because you have no equivalent. What Dana Sajdi has worked on in those narratives, city narratives, you have no equivalent for even Istanbul. It's only in the second half of the 19th century that the Ottomans will start to try to write about the history of Istanbul. So there is a problem of imbalance. And for the museum, I mean, until the 1880s, 40 years, 35 years of existence, most of the material is not even identified properly. One of my fun projects is to reconstitute the provenances of things that were thought to come from Salonika and end up being from Ashkelon. And how is that possible? It's possible because the museum was not a real museum until it took the format that Osman Hamdi gave it, but again, for an audience of purpose that is that of the West. He wants to be appreciated and recognized as an equal by Westerners. And that's it. It's only after 1908, 1910 that you start to see school children visiting the museum and whatever. The first museum that is really visited is the revamped Museum of the Janissaries, which becomes the military museum in 1917 in the middle of the war, because it becomes a symbol of patriotic, nationalistic mobilization, whatever. For the rest, it's extremely limited. So, once again, a catalog in a bubble is a catalog. You may appreciate it. It does not give you the right to assume that this catalog is really circulating, that it is creating ripples of whatever diffusion of knowledge around itself. The Westerners are using them much more. All the correspondence of the museum is about exchanges of books and catalogs with all the great museums of Europe. And there's practically no correspondence except for financial and administrative matters with the local institutions. So, but I recognize that I have a tendency to push it a little bit in the direction of the half-empty glass. That's true. But then again, I'm not making this up.
Question for Ahmed first, and then another question. About the Zainab, Sayyida Zainab debate, what actually triggered it? I mean, the work that went into it was antiquarian research, going into manuscripts and stuff, but was there actually a state kind of policy to eradicate the site or to restore it, or was it a discussion about Fatimid legacy and how?
No.
And that's the first question. Second question to both of you actually has to do with photography. Both of you dealt with photography and antiquarianism research. I think that's probably a topic for another workshop. In your case, Ahmed Zaki Basha was a pioneer in the use of photography. Do you have any information about how, was it a portable camera? How did he bring it to Istanbul? I know I've seen some of the photos there in Dar al-Kutub, they're preserved as manuscripts today. So if you have anything about that, and Edem, I know that you published on Ottoman photography, but in terms of the use of the camera in these museums that were not really museums, why were they taking pictures of objects at the time? What was the purpose of that?
Well, to start, I mean, it's not, within the debate, it's not clear what triggered it. I mean, Ahmed Zaki just started writing these articles as a kind of, public interest articles, but there is an issue just before that, which is about whether the government should invest in restoring the Sayyida Zainab Mosque. And eventually it is, the government does not recognize it as a historical site. So that probably has something to do with the discussion on it. As for the photography, unfortunately, I don't have technical details or knowledge about how he made those photos. But there is, when he talks about the Topkapi Palace adventure, he takes a team of Egyptians there. He says, it was 4 months of very happy and excited Egyptians, in the Topkapi Palace, just going through a library that is not properly catalogued and just randomly kind of finding stuff and photographing it. But that is, I think Thorsten Wolliner he's working on Ahmed Temur's collection, which is also, he also did a lot of photography. So that is, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because of course a lot of the manuscripts that had gone to Europe, for example, all were in these collections in Istanbul. They couldn't be taken back. There was no way of taking them actually back. So some people that I've studied for my book, like Ahmed al-Husseini, they travel around with copyists and they had stuff copied. But of course that's very slow. But elite collectors like Ahmed Zaki and Ahmed Temur, they used photography.
Photography is the big thing at the time, and it's part of the modus operandi. If you want to have a modern museum, you will photograph everything. And in 1883, 2 years into his mandate, Osman Hamdi strikes a deal with Sebah, Pascal Sebah, Christian Arab photographer, one of the major studios in Istanbul, for the photographing of all the collection. And this will be done again in the early 1890s by Sebah Joyer, which is the heir to Sebah. And what's interesting is that, as in all photographic studios, there's an overlap of different registers. That is, Sebah is doing this business for the museum, but he's also using some of these photographs as his commercial stock because he's selling it to tourists. Some of these objects are sexy enough to be sold, and you can identify them with the caption. When it says Fontaine Orientale, you can see that it really targets a you wouldn't do that for. There's only a number for those that were taken for the museum, but it's all, and this will be used when Gustave Mendel does the catalog, the final catalog of the Ottoman Museum. He will use these photographs to have drawings, because printing photographs is too expensive, but they are used as documentation. What is striking is that what is really photographed is only the classical stuff, the Greco-Roman, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, whatever stuff, manuscripts, Islamic objects. You have only those wide shots of the room, but no systematic photographing. That will come later in the 1910s after the creation of the Museum of Efkar. So you can follow how the Ottomans are discovering antiquities following a pattern and a format that is imposed by the West. They start with the most obvious, Greco-Roman, Mesopotamian, whatever, and when Kaiser Wilhelm suddenly discovers the joys of early Christianity and wants Byzantine objects, that's when they start collecting Byzantine objects. And when the Bodin Museum comes up with Islamic art, that's when they will have a systematic revamping of their Islamic collection. So they're following trends.
The last question was in the back. There was a question. Yeah.
To Adham again, I understand that perhaps we should not read too much in and realize that there is, yes, really none of the institutions, none of the people, but I think we should also give credit to when Osman Hamdi, perhaps not knowingly, he did some things. And you mentioned, for example, the Islamic artifacts were tucked in somewhere in a corner of the museum. Well, when the first museum, the Ottoman Imperial Museum, were built, when it was 2 levels, the second level was given to the Islamic one. So you have one level, the ground level, you have the antiquities, and the second Islamic. I don't think there is this idea of, and the Islamic ones are in the corner. I think that's a little bit of a misinterpreting the first museum. Later on, there were additions and so on, and I think when the Shah's reading of where these Islamic objects have been a little bit mistakenly interpreted there. So I feel like, yes, there was enough, at least from Osman Hamdi's perspective, a reason to document that maybe the Ottoman Empire at that time has these 2 faces, the Greek and Roman earlier antiquities, and Islam. And he does it at a moment when the others are not doing it. And from the museological perspective, these galleries are not bad. Maybe you have a more magnificent idea of how they should be studied and how should be cataloged. For that time, they are quite good and pioneers. The other, for example, maybe there is more dialogue in Egypt, but the Egyptian museum at that time is a heap of, that's where you can use the word heap. It's in the Mosque of El Hakim, and really objects are piled. Later on, when the real museum was built, yes, it was categorized, and in similar terms like the Ottoman Imperial Museum. So I see that perhaps we should not totally negate that there was a little bit of an organized thought, and maybe it wasn't Osman Hamdi, but the others that haven't been well studied that put effort in putting the the identity of the empire in a way that's visible also as a museum. Yes, it wasn't visited, but it is important to acknowledge that it did, this layer, this level existed as part of the first museum.
Okay, yes and no. I have the reputation of being an Osman Hamdi basher on top of being an Ottoman basher, which is not true because I love the guy. I find him extremely interesting because humanly, I think these faults, these flaws, are very endearing. It makes him very interesting. But if you compare him to Hadi Letem, it's like two different worlds. Hadi Letem is the guy who can read inscriptions, Kufic and whatever. They are 20 years apart. So it's really a totally different context. And Osman Hamdi has the capacity to adapt himself. When in the after 1908, there is talk of creating an independent museum of Islamic arts. He comes up with reports where he says, 30 years ago, that's exactly what I proposed. Come on. That's not exactly true, because when you say that it's the whole second floor, no, it's one room on the second floor.
No.
Two. It's not the whole thing. And look, we talked about the catalogs. Is there a single catalogue of the Islamic objects of the museum apart from coins? Not one. You have a catalogue for Byzantine and Greco-Roman marbles. You have a catalogue of Himyarite antiquities. You have practically everything except Islamic objects.
These don't exist in the other museums in the world at that time either. So there is not like the Islamic art hadn't been really studied as
no,
the
you're right.
Greco-Roman one.
That is,
So
it's collected. It's collected. It's not museified. In that sense, yes, I agree. And this is what Osman Hamdi is doing to a large extent. He's doing exactly the same thing. And there is this fluidity between his painting and these objects, which shows that he's using them as both historic and decorative objects, which is okay. I mean, that's not, but it's another category. I mean, it's another category from what he considers to be the real holdings of his museum, the real serious stuff on which you will work, for which you will conduct excavations. There are no systematic, there's Raqqa, of course, but there's no real systematic. And Raqqa is Makridi because he finds all these things in the middle of Raqqa, and he starts collecting them and starts appreciating them. But otherwise, there is no systematic campaign, systematic excavation of the Imperial Museum in the direction of promoting, excavating, bringing forward the Islamic heritage. It's not a crime. But but so there is a hierarchy in his mind as to what Hadi Letem will reverse that. Because Hadi Letem goes into Islamic epigraphy, he goes into the whole question of Seljuk architecture. He does proper thing, and that's after Osman Hamdi's death. He starts a little bit earlier, and it is something that, of course, has a direct connection to the change in ideologies and the desire of the new government to really. But otherwise, Abdul Hamid, we talk about pan-Islamism and whatever. What is striking in the Ottoman palace is that there is no use of anything, any art object of an autochthonous nature. The best they can do is order Orientalist furniture to French Parisian producers. That's the Azizian time. Mijid does Baroque and Rococo. And Hamid, what does he do? Well, he basically does arabesque, Moresque things in a very kitschy way, and throughout this period, and even well into the 1920s, not once even has the imperial palace acquired, for example, an Iznik plate. They're not doing that. They're not using what is already considered as their heritage as part of the decoration.
The mention of a plate reminds me that
Good transition.
for some of us, there is a
Rupture.
rendezvous with lunch. For the others who are here and who aren't going to have the pleasure of a working lunch, I want to thank you very much for coming. And let us all give our speakers and ourselves warm